o'clock?
Yes. Anytime you'd like to roll is good.
You think it's ready to start?
Roll set.
So I start speaking.
Yeah, go for it. Rob.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very honored to be doing a CelloChat on the Cello Bello site, and this is kind of new to me, so bear with me. But I know all of us are quarantining or variously in our living spaces during this time. I thought it would be really useful to talk about how we use our practice time. I think a lot of us are finding that we might have a little more time than we thought. And it's a nice time for reflection and examining our habits and maybe intensifying our degree of focus about how we're playing, what we're listening for, what we're feeling when we're playing. And I'm particularly interested at the moment in trying to connect the sensation of playing with the sound result. I think that as string players especially, but in any type of music making that doesn't come from within, like a vocalist, we have to create sound with motion. And the quality of our sound is profoundly influenced by the quality of our motions. So possibly the most important part of our day is the warm-up. And that's a time when we have to be at our most aware both of the quality of sound that we're producing immediately, to really tune in to the sonority, the intonation, the ring with the cello, and also the sensations that are creating that sound. So I thought that would be a great place to start today. And then I'm really happy to take questions, and we'll be guided by those. But I can start with a couple of ideas just about movement. When we're playing, we have to have a highly developed sense of kinesthetic awareness. I believe another term for it is proprioception, which is awareness of our body in space when we're playing. And if you imagine two basic planes of motion that we can use, there's the plane of the floor, plane parallel to the floor. And in fact, that's pretty easy to experience if I say we were polishing a table with our palms or even our whole forearms to feel that. One of the things that we can do as cellists is very much become aware of anti-clockwise and clockwise circles. If anybody's seen the classic Karate Kid film, there's the scene where he has to simonize an enormous amount of cars, and the sensei has him do wax on right hand, wax off left hand, and he's describing two circles in a perpendicular plane in that particular exercise. Well, in cello we have two basic planes in bowing. One is the plane parallel to the floor, and one is the plane perpendicular to the strings. And without those two planes, we can't produce really fluid motion. Any motion that we use to generate sound needs to be elliptical in nature. That's also going to complement the muscle structure of our shoulders, which generally are in spiral. It's a very complicated joint. The shoulder joint's got, I think, 17 working parts at least, or 17 muscles. So you have an enormous amount of complexity there. But our joints respond really well to circular motion. So I suppose if you're getting ready to play, you could warm up by feeling those two planes and possibly wash a couple of windows with either hand. The other thing is, in shifting, we have the preparatory part of a shift. Anytime we're going to shift, especially up and over the shoulder of the cello, we are preparing our shift with a clockwise circular motion of the elbow. So that's emanating from the shoulder joint. But I call it a throw the ball shift. We're preparing the wind up with the upper arm and the delivery with the forearm. So you always need to have a sense of that. We talk about the shifting clock. I always tell the students that between 9 o'clock and 12 o'clock, it's always shifting time. And that means that the elbow has to get to a certain point in the clock to go up and over. And on the descent, you reverse the circle, so you've got an anti-clockwise circle coming back. So those are a couple general things. I can show you a couple short exercises just to experience the horizontal plane of motion. One of them I got from my teacher in Scotland, Jane Cowan, and her son was a great bird watcher, and he told her that this reminded him of an owl looking for mice in the fields. If you look all the way around the room, starting to the left, all the way to the right, and if you have a partner playing opposite you, you can always wish them a good day. Good morning. So that way you're traveling in a horizontal plane, and I think as you're doing that, you probably notice that you're turning from the hips and that your shoulders are turning to address each individual string. This is, my teacher, Jane Cowan, stole this from Izai. I think it's a violin exercise that she adapted. You can see that in various, I think there's reference to it in different violin methods. So that's the owl, which is across the cello left to right motion, just to, and leading with the eyes is useful at the beginning just to get ourselves feeling the whole room. So
we
that
actually had a question from our audience related to left-hand balance. This is from Felipe, and he wondered if performing the pump, he would like you to elaborate on how to perform the pump, and also about the relationship of the thumb to the
individual
left hand.
fingers.
Exactly.
Well, it sounds like, Felipe, thanks for your question. It sounds like you might have a copy of the cello ergonomics book that has some warm-ups in it. And that's actually one of the more complicated exercises to describe. I was taught that by a student of Mr. Starker's who had focused her vibrato admirably, and I asked her how she did it, and about an hour and a half later I had a great lesson from her. She was an alumni. But the pump exercise is essentially an effort to release the weight of the hand into the flexing finger. So if we were going to do that exercise, it's basically a way of getting the vibrato into the finger. Sort of, I think we're stealing a little bit of violin vibrato here. So if you take your finger and place it on a G natural, which would be a good place to do this, and that's a sympathetic resonance. At the top of the arch of the finger, the fully arched finger, that's our pitch. And if you pull back so that the finger straightens and the elbow pulls back a little bit, you go a little below pitch and back up to pitch. So this hopefully keeps us vibrating up to the pitch and not over the pitch. If you rotate too much, it starts driving the pitch sharp, and that's the rotary vibrato, which we all need at the beginning of our studies, but later on we need to channel the energy into the finger. So I would do that on each finger in turn, making sure that the fully arched finger is at the apex of the motion. Now the feeling in the thumb is a very light but definite counterbalancing of the playing finger. One of my colleagues in England, Joan Dixon, who was a colleague of my teacher, she used to say the best hand position for playing melodic passages was a finger connected to a blob, and the blob hand. And Joan Dixon referred to that quite a bit. And I think if we start with this pump exercise, it's also a way of limbering up the finger joints, especially in the morning. I find it increasingly useful as I get older. So I hope that's a clear enough explanation.
Absolutely. We had a couple of other questions about, this one's more of a musical question from Anna Hura about asking how you approach developing different sounds and colours within your sound. I guess this is probably in a lyrical piece like this one.
Sure. Well, we have three factors to work with in the bow, because the bow is creating the sound, the left hand is coloring the sound. So we have the sounding point, what sounding point we choose, we have the speed of bow, and we have the depth of motion, or the well, you could say pressure or weight, depending on which part of the bow you're in. So if I was to start the Dvorak's second movement, I might want to have a lighter up bow. Excuse me, my cello's not connected to the floor. I'm using, just for that tiny bit of phrase, I'm using several different bow speeds. I'm trying to start with a slightly slower bow that speeds up. And that bow slows down on the resolution of the phrase. So I'm also imagining that I'm using an anti-clockwise, or I call it an up and over bow for a pickup. If I dipped into the sound right away, it might be a little too present, so I think I would do an anti-clockwise generated motion. I'm also leaning towards my left foot. You'll notice that I changed my body swing before I changed the bow. When we have a bow change, it's always better to lead with the rest of you first. So I thought of that. If you think of it in miles per hour, you're going about 20 miles per hour to 40 to 15 to 10. Also varying the bow weight, because when I get to an arrival point like that, I need all of my arm weight. So it's great to have the arrival moments at the lower part of the bow. In this case, so I'm using arm weight in a melody. I use arm weight and bow weight to get the sense of arrival. You can feel this if you sing it. And I use bow speed on the leaps to show the intervals. So you've got two axes musically. You've got the axis of intervals and you've got the axis of harmony. Generally, the intervals dictate bow speed. That's a long answer to a short question.
Thanks. I was actually interested myself in the way you're explaining how the weight versus speed, really the way to generate tone color is from understanding how you can physicalize the horizontal versus the vertical.
I like to work with this because it's part of our kinesthetic tool set. If I can feel the speed producing, it's try to organize your phrases. Find out when you're trying to work out a bowing, for example, figure out where the landing point in the phrase is and experience this, the weight there, or even in a short phrase segment, you usually have a point of greatest speed of bow and a point of greatest weight of bow, and they're almost never in the same place. They have different functions. The weight is really easy to think of the vertical, and that's the harmonic. What's delightful about this one is it's a double harmonic scrunch, because you're going to a B natural, but the orchestra is playing a seventh, so you got this amazing suspension, and that's where we really need to tug against the resistance of the string. So that's, you're really pulling into the string in a moment like that.
We had another question from our audience, and this is from Stephen Grant asking how the how to shift and what role the body, arm, and fingers each have to play in good shifting and in different types of shifting.
Right. Well, I could give you a little bit of a précis about that. Say I was working on arpeggiated shifting. We have a couple, Starker used to call them anticipated and delayed connections. I sometimes oversimplify by calling it an old finger shift or a new finger shift. And the type or the class of shift you're doing also might call forth a different use of your bow. But if you were doing an arpeggio, now I'm putting some guide notes in here. This is a practice technique actually. It's an arpeggiated shifting exercise. It's also in that ergonomics book. But I would definitely practice anticipating the upward shift, which is an outward rotated shift because I'm going from a low to a high finger. So if I'm going from low to high, that's a rainbow shift, I sometimes call them, or an outward rotated shift. That's two rainbows. Now I'm also, if you want to do this, it's good fun. All your notes, that we say all your notes are on the practice room wall. So if I start a little bit turned to the left, in my first position, if I was a baseball player and I was playing catcher position, my A string is third base and my C string is first base, and the center field is out that way. And actually you can even use your shortstop position when you need to. So when I'm doing this kind of a shift, if I wanted to lead with my eyes just to get my body oriented to the move, I'm moving maybe 20 to 30 degrees. So if you measure on the wall, an octave shift is generally about 45 degree turn. As you work up the cello, you're basically working around the room. I sometimes tell the kids an octave shift is an eighth of a pizza, because it's a smaller slice, and a 2 octave shift is actually a quarter of a pizza because it's a 90 degree move. So that the horizontal axis plays into this, but that's the big move, and that's sort of the body supporting the movement. The thing about the old finger shift is it's generally a rainbow or elliptical outward rotated. Now if I wanted to do an inward rotated shift from a higher numbered finger to a lower number, which is a really nice way to shift, practicing sixths, say. I am doing a preparatory motion with my left elbow. You probably could see the shifting clock in the first one that I did. I call it a rainbow because it's quite a gentle, you start the curve and then you follow through with the arm. With a new finger shift, which goes inward rotated shift, you do the preparatory motion, but then the forearm takes over. So you have actually more velocity in the shift. The delivery system is faster and more, in a way it's a more excitable sound. As you go up the cello, you're going to get more and more velocity on the upward shifts in that way. So both of those types of shifts are worth practicing in your warm-up. You'll notice in a normal arpeggio, as you go up the string, almost all of those shifts are forward scoops or inward rotated.
He has another question actually to do with the warm-up.
Sorry.
I think it just definitely touches on what you were just getting into with our warm-up routine. And this question is asking about scales. How should we practice them, and how long should we be practicing them for?
Scales are essential. Once I'm warmed up with what I call the roll exercise, this is also something Mr. Starker used to use. And I've got my axes of movement. Then I would use a scale to connect all the registers of the cello. And you'll notice a lot of great music is made up of scales and arpeggios in varied variations on them. So the scale would be I would start with, I love threes, but fours, 2, 4, 6, 8 is a great thing to do if you're using slurred scales. And if you're using 3, I would do 3 to a bow, and I would probably use more bow at the tip. Now I'm not only playing my scale, I'm also counter rocking. I'm moving against the bow. Now I'm trying to do all my shifts in slow motion when I start, because the most important thing in the early part of the warm-up is smoothness. And that's smoothness it creates power. It also creates beautiful connections. So I would always try to start with a slower tempo. You might go on to 6 to a bow. Coming down, you'll have. Coming down, you're going to have what we call the backwards rainbow move, which is a backwards substitution off the lower numbered finger. At first, it's nice to practice the guide notes. And eventually, you interrupt that, dropping the finger into place. But I think it's important to always start slow. So I would do 2 to a bow, 3 to a bow, and then double the number of notes gradually. When you're working for fluency, try to go for longer and longer groups. I might go 3, 6, 9, 12, and 18 is an idealistic number of notes, but it's fun to try.
But to start with a legato.
Definitely legato. The other thing is, early in the day, I play my scales. If I'm working on a scale passage, I'll work at détaché in the lower third of the bow to make sure my arm weight is always engaged. The bottom of the bow is, we have, from the balance point to the frog, we've got free weight. So triplet rhythm is great because it takes you out to the balance point and back. And then I definitely recommend using mixed patterns, either in 2/4. Now I'm practicing my articulation with my fingers. Sometimes we call these Burke bows. And then eventually legato. I love legato patterns in 6/8, so I might do 2 plus 1, and then 1 plus 2. So when we're doing scales, it's not just, it's for all of our mechanisms. It's not just for the left hand, and we want to include the bow in everything we do.
I wanted to actually bring up a question that might follow that up. From Liz Brewster, she's asking about bow distribution with respect to Bach, the first Bach suite,
Really?
and especially when there are 3+1 groupings,
Yes.
like in the prelude, where it's hard to control where you are in the bow, and
Indeed.
just achieving bow control with uneven slurring pattern.
Yes, well that's tricky. Also, if you look at, I really like, when I'm working on Bach, I like to compare Magdalena's manuscript with Kellner's manuscript, because they're, I believe, the two most contemporary. Magdalena, in that case, she was in the household. But Kellner was also a contemporary and a wonderful copyist. His copies of Bach's violin manuscripts are very close to the original. And they have sometimes the same, they're both looking at the same manuscript, but sometimes they have different ideas. And Einar Bilsma's book, Bach the Fencing Master, refers to some of the inconsistencies in Anna Magdalena's as creative, and he likes varying that pattern so you're not stuck with it all the time. But if you wanted a 3+1, I would creep back on the second repeat. So the first slur takes us out to the balance point. And then you've got little tiny finger circles to get your string crossing. And then you're there. And that's, my colleague and spouse calls that a background up bow. Up, up, down. Especially because I think there's an implied a little bit of an echo when he repeats the harmony. So it's nice to do one lower and then I would definitely reserve the frog for harmonic arrivals or instigations where you're starting a pattern off. I tend to like to vary some of those bowings. And you can decide how consistent you want to be and when you want to diverge from the pattern.
Speaking of consistency,
takes when you're making a shift. It's a great way to measure it. Metronome really measures time for you. If you imagine that when you're playing, there is a pitch grid telling us where the notes are. There's a time grid telling us when we have to play the notes. And then, then there's the motion grid, which connects the notes. So if I had the metronome clicking away, and I'll use that silly exercise just as an illustration. I'll try it a little bit faster. It makes me more aware of the subpulse within a shift. So I think in this case, dum pa da dum pa da. So I'm trying to measure exactly where my preparatory impulse is within each beat. It's really good when you're playing scales and arpeggios because when you have the metronome slow enough, you can measure all of the shifts that way. Now the question was, in passage work also, I've gone off on a...
No, this is good. was just asking more generally about using a metronome and using a tuner in your daily practice. So far we've done the metronome, and it seems like from what you were saying, the metronome is a really good way to map your motion, and it shifts the
well, when you're
pitch.
working under tempo, it's a great way of measuring how long it's going to take to get from point A to point B. And then if you gradually increase your metronome speed, you'll see that connective time, sometimes we can say there's two definitions of technique. One is being in the right place at the right time. That's for the left hand. And the other thing is technique is the stuff in between the notes, which means all these motions that we need to use to get from point A to point B, or to get from one bow to another. All of that's measurable. So the metronome is incredibly helpful that way. The tuner is really good if you're playing in, I would use open strings mostly, but sometimes we're playing in a very unusual or difficult key to hear. For example, when you're playing with piano, the piano is tempered, and we all love to play our sharps a little higher and our flats a little lower, but sometimes the basic temperament has to be reckoned with. So you can use, I would mostly use a tuner for a drone. So I remember in the Brahms F major, the slow movement, which is an F sharp major. Well, the piano, an F sharp and a G flat, it's the same key. So I hate tempered intonation in general, but in that case, I would get a G flat or an F sharp on the tuner and try to work with it. But then I would use the tuner to line up perfect fifths and perfect fourths. But the other intervals are mutable. The thirds can be varied. You can play a smaller minor third or a larger major third, depending on your priorities musically. There's wonderful ways of bending the tone up from, for example, there's a place in the Don Quixote at the end of the soliloquy. Now there's a kind of in the orchestra, then you have a B flat, and I'm going to move it to an A sharp, to a B. So there's some places where you actually are going to move from a flat to a sharp slightly audibly. Obviously, it's got to be done really discreetly. For consistency, the tuner can really help us when we're in a key. So I would use the primary, I would use the tonic, and I would use the fifth or the fourth. So if you were worried about playing in tune high up in a flat key, I would set the tuner, say, on an E flat. If you and measure your fourths and fifths against that.
We have a couple of questions about time management in practice, and I think that a couple of people have touched on that issue, but some of what they brought up was about how long you should warm up for, and also how to prepare a piece under a deadline.
Right. Yeah. Well, gosh, a good warm-up should, if your warm-up is efficient, it shouldn't take you more than 40 minutes, 45 minutes to start to feel pretty fluent at the instrument. But if you have more time, obviously warm-up is a wonderful thing to extend, especially if you're going to warm up and then, for example, you could say the first warm-up is to get enough fluency to start doing your scales and arpeggios, so that could be 15 minutes to get comfortable and make sure you're listening well. Then you could be spending half an hour doing scales and arpeggios. Maybe you're going to spend another 15 minutes doing double stopping, so we're already in an hour. Then you might have studies, so you might want to spend 20 minutes to a half an hour working on a portion of a study, or even working your way through a couple of them that you know well. Then you might end up starting to work on passage work from your pieces. I tend to think that organizing your practice I always think we should go for comfort first in the warm-up. Make sure that you're really comfortable and balanced when you're warming up, so that when you start to do more and more complicated things, your smoothness is there already. As soon as you feel like if you feel like as you're practicing, you're starting to tie up or get tense, back up a few steps and kind of go back to the warm-up principles. I've made a list of ingredients for successful practice once for our students, and I was assuming we all had, say, 4 hours in a day. So the warm-up, the scales and arpeggio, and the etude segment was at least an hour and a half or so. But it depends on how much time you've got. If you need to warm up quickly, there are certain shortcuts you can take. I want to make sure when I'm warming up fast that I have balance in my left hand and that my bow changes are working. So that would be a pre-rehearsal warm-up. I might do, I call it T for 2. I'm trying to feel the release in my upper arm on the bow side, and I'm trying to feel the rotation on the left side, and a lively sense of the vibrato being connected to the finger articulation.
We have a question actually about another Bach suite. This is the sixth suite. One second, let me find the person who contributed this. Basically, yes, the substance of the question was about how to feel balanced on double stops, especially in Bach sixth suite.
Well, the sixth suite, if you're playing it on a 4-string cello, you've got some extreme challenges because you're having to roll chords across in the upper positions, and that's quite difficult. I've recently relearned the piece on the 5-string piccolo cello, and it spoiled me a little bit because some of the most difficult chording is in first position when you have an E string over here. Trick is not getting confused about which string you're on. But the question was more about thumb position work or balancing?
Yes, maybe another question related to that is about balancing your vibrato in thumb position. How do you balance your vibrato in the same way that you balance in neck positions?
Yes.
Often cellists
we all
experience how it can get more difficult to control the tighter, the higher.
Well, in the lower positions, we all know where the thumb goes up to 4th position because it's living comfortably under the neck. Obviously, on the higher strings in the lower positions, the thumb is more under the low strings, and on the lower strings, when in the lower position, the thumb is more, it rotates around to the upper string. So you've got a lower elbow on the high string and a higher elbow on the low strings. Well, if you carry the high elbow idea forward, you're now in the upper position. So you could even start by being on the C string. There we are. And the elbow actually is in pretty much in the same general area that was in 5th position on the C string when you go up. I often like to do this in a master class. I'll ask the person playing to me if they have a cat at home. And it doesn't matter whether they say yes or no. If they say they don't have a cat, I say, well, you can pretend you have one. And do the meow with your finger. So that...
Dropping the thumb to make a sound.
Yeah, we're dropping the thumb. Now, it's a fun trick. You can also tell him it's karaoke kitty, because then the cat's trying to be Frank Sinatra or something. So you can vibrate. What we're really doing essentially is dropping, we're rotating the forearm so that the thumb drops onto the string. If you put your hand, one way of finding this out is put your hand on a table with your thumb up and then drop towards the thumb. The two bones in the forearm will cross as you're doing this, and you'll feel the weight of the thumb landing. So when you're in thumb position, it's really important for the thumb and the playing finger to be in a comfortable balance. And that's... I think the most important thing is that the big bump on the thumb is on the, if you're on the A string, that's your bottom, that's the basis of your position. So the thumb really is an axis, and you can fire the fingers from there out. I don't know if that helps a little bit.
Absolutely, and I just noticed when you were demonstrating, talking about the thumb and the finger in play being connected, but in more, of course, in faster passages, the handshake remains consistent. But what do you do when it's a little bit more of a melody in the thumb positions?
Well, it's really important to release the non-playing fingers. So if you have a longer if you have a long note or even just a melodic note, I think it's really important to release the fingers you're not playing. It's great to be in position when you're going fast. We don't have time, but in the same piece in the Beethoven, I've got just time to release 1 and 2, send them on vacation, and then they're back. But actually by releasing the non-playing fingers, we're generating a little bit of extra centrifugal force, which helps to loosen the vibrato and make it more expressive. I like Hans Jensen's description of the forearm action in the thumb position in vibrato, because the forearm is sweeping across the cello, but then we've got the fingers to generate a balance point for that motion, and the thumb really helps. People that are trying to freewheel with the thumb in the air usually have to put too much pressure on the finger, and sometimes the structure of the hand collapses. So I would always practice thumb position with the thumb as your basis.
So we've got a question from Zachary McGee asking about practicing to address technical habits they wanted to change, and I think other people on the chat have been talking about tension and shoulder tension, and I was just wondering what your advice is about. People are wondering what your advice would be about changing habits which cause you to feel tense while playing.
Well, if there's tension in your body, it's really important to start from the floor up. If you can't feel your feet really connecting with the floor when you're playing, that's already going to cause problems. So sometimes we talk about feet, seat, bow, breath. So that's a 4-stepper. If you're going to start something, plant your feet on the ground, plant your tailbone on the chair, plant your bow on the cello, and see if you can feel that all of you is connected to the left hand and the bow. If you're on your tiptoes and your back is arched and your shoulders are up, for sure you're going to play inefficiently, just a guarantee.
So breath is very important.
One of the biggest contributors to releasing tension is becoming aware of your physical breathing. So, for example, we have a couple different principles. One is always change breath before you change bow. Say I'm breathing in, So I would release the breath before the change of bow. When you release the breath, it relaxes basically, if somebody told me I just lost all my money in the stock market, which is rather apropos, it's like, oh dear, that's a release. And if somebody said I just won the lottery, I'd be very excited and my hands would feel like they weighed nothing. So when you and that's an inhale. Really? Oh dear. So it's like body language. The breath it's crucial actually. Without breath, we can't have an integrated sense of motion.
So I guess the other...
I would first of all look at your breathing and see whether just observe your breathing when you're playing something difficult. See what's happening. If you're holding your breath, that's going to cause all kinds of tension to sort of, domino theory. It's going to start the tension rolling.
One other question that I think ensues from Zachary McGee's comment is about practicing. We addressed practicing to delete bad habits, but practicing to acquire new technical skills. How do you do that, and what roles do pauper studies play?
Oh boy, pauper studies are amazing. They're very useful for all of us. I'm in this time of COVID-19. I'm learning more of them. Some that I had ignored for years. But first of all, you can't delete a bad habit. But a habit can only be changed by finding a more comfortable, more natural habit. And what we do when we're working for technique is we're trying to find a series of maneuvers that help us with a passage that are both comfortable and musically satisfying. If we're comfortable and we're not making a good sound, well, it's nice to be comfortable, but that's not going to get us there. But if we're miserable and we're making a good sound, that's not going to last. So I'll practice a little passage from the Elgar last movement for you as a way of thinking about this. So the first part of this, I have to release my breath to get my arm weight into the cello, and I'm also releasing my low back a little bit. And that's a like, oh, it's a waking up motion. So that's a, I'm getting taller as I go through the slur. Then it happens again. I'm trying to find where my weight is, where I'm releasing it. And you probably notice that I'm kind of using a body wave to help me get the dynamic contour. Any type of technical bit. For example, that shift often trips us up. The first thing I want to do is get comfortable with the shift. Then I can plug it back into the time frame. Right now I'm taking a lot of time just to feel the maneuvers. So sometimes practicing for comfort is the first step. When you find a comfortable maneuver, you can usually work out. When you play slower, the motions are larger. As you start to play faster, the motions will get smaller, but the germ of the motion or the nature of the motion should stay in your playing. I hope that's useful.
Absolutely. We've got a question from Niraj Patil asking about can you give any tips on making smooth bow changes?
Well, yeah, I think I was just talking about change the breath before the change the bow. Is he more concerned with the frog or the tip? He or she, sorry.
I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, if you're at the frog, imagine the bow arm as a breaking wave. And imagine the change of bow is the wave coming up towards the beach. And at some point, when the water gets shallower, the wave breaks, and you get that happening. The wave's momentum in the bow arm is from the top down. So you've got the upper arm moving. The last thing to happen, the breaking wave, is the fingers. So you've got arm releasing, and I have to release the fingers and the thumb. So if you were to look at the bow change from underneath, you might see my thumb straightening a little bit when I go into the change and then retrieving the bow. So that's really important, that the first thing you might want to do to make a smooth bow change is just make sure that you've got a nice pivoting action between your thumb and your fingers. Sometimes we call this going fishing. Sometimes we do also windshield wipers, just to make sure that you've got a vertical pivoting action and a horizontal pivoting action. Then when you're playing a change of bow, Duport used to say at the change of bow at the frog, the tip of the bow should go, I believe he said, vers le tapis, towards the tapestry, and that's generally towards the carpet. So I use a little bit of I call it a smile bow or a smirk bow, that the tip reaches out. It's going to reach out a little bit towards the camera here, right at that moment. So that's the plane parallel to the floor that I'm using. If I try to maintain an absolutely straight bow all the way to the change, I tend to try to suspend my upper arm and it becomes tense. So I want to release a little bit and use a tiny bit of angle to steer the bow through the change. The first principle, though, I think you could work on would be the breaking wave. And you could do it different ways. On an up bow, you could go from a low to a high string. If you go from low to high at the frog, you're going to feel your fingers releasing to the upper string. And if you do the same thing at the tip, you're going to feel an anti-clockwise or wax-on circle that's generated from the upper arm and followed through with the forearm. So that's upper arm, forearm. Whereas at the frog, the upper arm releases, the fingers take over. So you can work on, I would work on bow changes across two strings at first, and then see if some of that action I just demonstrated across two strings pertains to the single string.
We've got a question about how to go about learning a new piece and what your process is for doing that.
Well, Rostropovich was famous for saying, always learn your new pieces at the piano. And another advice is don't listen to only one recording. And sometimes it's good not to listen to any recordings. Try to figure it out for yourself. Try not to start imitating. I would try to map the piece out at the keyboard. If you're not comfortable that way, well, look at it away from the cello a little bit. See what you can hear. And then I suppose
suggestions about fingerings and how and when to decide on a bowing and fingering plan.
Well, it depends on what stage you're at. Some of that's just a trial and error, and of course, if your teacher is in the loop with you, they can give you some recommendations. But very often, it's interesting to see what people come up with. I try to use fingerings that go with the words in a piece, and I have imaginary words. So I've got a ridiculous example in I think it's the fourth variation in the Beethoven E-flat variations. Here we go, sorry. So I always, if you wanted to be silly with that, you could say, I'd really like an ice cream. And an ice cream is a change of position. And it also happens to be a musical arrival because it's a change, it's a strong beat in the phrase. So when you're working out fingerings, try to make sure the fingering goes with the phrasing. And try to make sure that you have down bows where you need them. I don't think too many of us start the swan up bow. Unless we just love that E so much we can't avoid it. So it seems logical to start down and to have an arrival. So the bowings have to have musical logic. And look at the phrase shapes. If you're not sure about a phrase shape, I used to use tracing paper and lay it on top of my music and draw the shape of the phrase. Try to make friends with the piece as if you were a fellow composer admiring the work that your colleague had written. Try to find out what's wonderful, what's unusual, even what's weird about the piece. What makes it different from other pieces of the same period. Try to put it in some kind of musical context. And then if you're learning a piece, your cellistic skills, what we call pure technique, which is your scales, arpeggios, and fluency that you do every day when you're warming up, that all should apply to the piece eventually. But the piece should be studied first without too much instrumental bias. Then when you put it with the cello, I think you'll have you can't just be the bricklayer, you've got to be the architect. Then there's the contractor, and then there's the bricklayer. You have to do all those jobs.
A couple of short questions. There's a question about how rounded to have your left-hand position.
It depends on what you're playing. If you're playing quick passages, you need really quick, well-arched fingers to go quickly. But if you're playing a tune, you can use more of the pad. Actually, sometimes the more the merrier. So if you're playing any beautiful melody, I definitely, even on the swan, I might even start with my third because I have a better pad. But if I was playing really fast, or proper 7, you don't want to be anything but arched for that. So the arched finger is a quick articulated thing for coloratura. The finger pad is for melodies.
There's a question about getting that kind of articulation with the bow when working on spiccato.
Staccato?
Spiccato.
Spiccato.
How you go about teaching that.
Yeah, one great way to work on your spiccato is don't let your bow bounce. So if you're working on Elgar, say, try to find the friction point for the stroke before you do anything else. Navarre was famous for having all his pupils play spiccato stroke in the upper middle until they were almost going crazy, and then he'd say, okay, now move it towards the balance point and relax, and they'd suddenly find it was bouncing. Starker used to say, if you press your thumb against your second finger and pretend to bow, you guys can do this, I guess, that's on the string, and if you release your thumb from your second finger and bow, that's off the string. So basically, if you practice on the string, you should hear a little bit of rub-dub-dub going on. There's almost a bang when the string is reversing direction. That's the little hairs on the bow knocking the string in the other way. So you could play the whole thing that way. And eventually, of course, that's going to get a bit monotonous. So then I would mix on and off. And there's something we call bounce the stick, not the hairs. I don't think you'll be able to see this, but if somebody's bouncing their bow effectively, you can find a bounce where the hairs are still pretty connected to the string. If I try to bounce by lifting the hairs, I get a mess. And you'll see that the bow is designed so that it flexes wonderfully and produces the bounce. So basically the spiccato stroke comes from on the string playing. Very good piece to work on that when you're first doing it is the Van Gogh Scherzo. Because when you go across the string, it's actually easier to let it bounce. But at first, just play fairly generous on the string détaché with some pressure and try to keep the upper arm from getting tight. Try to make sure that you're moving, supporting from the shoulder blades and being comfortable that way.
So maybe just time for a couple more questions here, but I think we've been getting some questions about vibrato, and one of the questions is from a participant, Seiko Miki, is asking, could you talk about tips on continuous vibrato?
Well,
connecting vibrato from one note to the next.
Well, continuous vibrato is a beautiful thing if you keep varying it. Vibrato should not always be the same, but to go from note to note, it's very important. I know Tim Eddy talks about the vibrato being part of the ecology of the left hand, so that articulation and vibrato go together. When you articulate, if you want to connect from note to note, going up in semitones in this case, continuous vibrato is a result of a constant rhythmic motion of the arm, and it can be faster or slower depending on your musical need. But one way to control your vibrato or learn to control it is to clock it. So this would be a place for the metronome. You could put a metronome on, click, click. So if I wanted 4 to a wiggle, so I would start with closed position where you're just in semitone. And make sure every finger is balanced. And you'll notice also you're probably rotating a little out. So we call it plop them down and peel them off. Plop the finger down, and that'll help you. You'll also feel, you always have to think about the connection between the finger action and the elbow and the upper arm and the whole arm working as a unit.
It's interesting to think about continuous vibrato because from what you're describing, actually the continuous part is a bit of an illusion because you have to actually restart it for.
Yeah, you could think about the when you drop. Hopefully, with continuous vibrato, the notes are within the rhythm of the arm. So now I think I had 5 per note there. So you'll adjust your speed depending on what you want. Also, vibrato should go from narrow to wide or wide to narrow. For example, I call the narrow vibrato the I want vibrato. Famous Dvorak passage. When I get to the arrival on the downbeat, I want to have a wider vibrato, but before that, I want a more narrow one. I want to go from this finger to this finger. So I'm going from wide to narrow. So make sure that you include phrasing in part of your plan for continuous vibrato. I would play sometimes the left hand and sing whatever you're playing, and see if the hand is actually participating in the phrasing.
Brilliant. Well, that's all the time we have for right now.
I want to thank my assistant Ben for doing this with me.
And thanks to everyone who tuned in and submitted your questions. We're sorry we couldn't get to all of you, but thanks to Cello Bello, Paul Katz for thinking of it, and for William Suh, who's been so instrumental in making this work.
Thanks, Will, for helping us with that.
Right, so that's all from us. Have a good week, everyone. Wait, one sec. To figure out how